Good evening. Everyone can hear me okay as well, hopefully. Brilliant. Okay, so for this event, we are joined by two researchers studying different aspects of women's experiences in the field of modern yoga, kind of contemporary practice. In some ways, Agi Wittich's work on Iyengar Yoga is in some ways a case study for the structural analysis that Ella Potianen's work provides on the divine feminine more generally. So what we kind of have here is not just two fascinating pieces of research, but two different approaches, two different ways of studying contemporary practice, one of which is ethnographic, focusing on kind of lived experience in some detail, and the other of which is more sociological, focusing on the kind of wider structural analysis. To give you a little bit more detail before we go into it, Agi Wittich wrote her PhD dissertation on the subject of women-oriented Iyengar yoga practices under the supervision of Dr. Yohanan Grishpan and Dr. Ronit Ritchie at the Department of Comparative Religions at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. Wittich also leads an academic interdisciplinary study group called Femininity in the Religious Sphere at the same university. And when she's not researching yoga, she practices and teaches Iyengar yoga in Israel as well. So she understands a lot about Iyengar yoga from kind of many different positions. And specifically when we're talking about women-oriented Iyengar yoga, her contention is that this is on one and the same time something specific and different, and yet also extremely prevalent in Iyengar yoga more generally. It's a key feature of Iyengar yoga. So her talk is going to discuss women-oriented Iyengar yoga's intentions and practices in answering the corporeal needs and the socially situated needs of women in those classes. Her research will analyze the ways in which these practices both challenge and reinforce gender normative roles. And then we come to Ella Potianen, who's a doctoral candidate in gender studies at the University of Turku. In her MA thesis, she examined the ways in which contemporary yoga is gendered and focused on feminine yoga as an embodied method of empowerment. And her ongoing doctoral research project leads from that to an ethnographic study exploring the themes of women's empowerment and societal change in the field of holistic spirituality more generally. And her talk today will be exploring the increasing trend in holistic spirituality to develop divine feminine or feminine approaches to varying traditions of spiritual practice. From the perspective of feminist theory, Ella considers how this spirituality can be problematic in its essentialism and its binary understandings in gender, but in other ways challenges and reworks traditional gender roles and even promotes gender fluidity. And without further ado, we're going to start with Agi, we'll move to Ella, and then we'll ask you to put your questions in the Slido as discussed, and we'll do all of the Q&A at the end with both speakers. So passing over now to Agi.
Thank you, Theo and Vicky, for organizing this talk and for your work with organizing all these events and keeping the conversations around contemporary yoga going. And thank you all for joining in and taking the time to think about the meanings of contemporary yoga through the lenses of both Indology or Asian studies and gender theory. So as Theo just said, this talk is based on my PhD research, which focuses on women-oriented Iyengar yoga. And for 5 years, between 2015 and 2019, I've conducted interviews with the Iyengar yoga family members, including Geeta, Prashant, and Abhijata Iyengar, for those of you who are familiar with them, and with more than 40 Iyengar yoga teachers from different countries, including India, Israel, the USA, Germany, Italy, among others. And in my research, I also analyzed more than 100 Iyengar yoga texts, including books and manuals, periodical publications of the newspaper Yoga Rahasya, notes from Iyengar yoga conferences, as well as written correspondences between Iyengar yoga family members and Iyengar yoga teachers. And in today's talk, I'd like to share an idea that I find to be true in my study case, but is perhaps also true in others' cases when a tradition or a live religion is changed and transformed in order to accommodate contemporary community members. So I prepared there it is, a nice slide for you. Okay. So the case study of my research is women-oriented Iyengar Yoga, which is basically a tailored yoga practice for the needs of women. It is based on the belief of the Iyengar tradition that a classical yoga existed in the past or still exists, and that it is inherently unsuited to fulfill women's needs. So therefore, the Iyengar tradition developed, or rather, I would say created, a new sub-discipline that is woman-oriented, which is by definition different from general or classical yoga. This newly developed yoga is supposed to be tailored to suit women. Consequently, it relies on generalizations, which in turn negate the factual diversity of women. As a result, I argue that while initially intended to suit women and materialize inclusiveness, it fails to do so. Instead, it reinforces, perhaps unintentionally, notions of womanhood, pronatal ideology, biology as destiny, and gender binary. When analyzed closely, I would argue the adaptations imply assumptions regarding what women are, what do they need, and what do they lack. In a way, women-oriented Iyengar yoga practices reinforce gender norms through doing gender. So what are women-oriented Iyengar yoga practices? This is a term that I coined to describe the practices within the Iyengar tradition that are meant to accommodate the needs of women and to distinguish them from other general or non-women-oriented practices. By this, I do not refer to women-only classes, since women-oriented practices can be found in mixed classes as well. They can be also practiced as part of a practitioner's independent home practice. They include verbal instructions, such as those that explicitly refer to female body parts, physical practices, such as postures and breathing techniques, and socio-cultural considerations, such as the decision to create classes at a convenient time for mothers, offering women-only classes, and accepting women in traditional or religious attire. But interestingly, even though women-oriented yoga is widespread and taught globally by Iyengar teachers, it is unnamed and is not recognized as a separate layer of knowledge within the tradition. I was told in interviews that there is no separate yoga practice for women. Some teachers compared women's yoga to therapeutic yoga, meaning that these practices are meant to treat ailments such as fibroids and menstrual irregularities. Or sometimes yoga for women was framed as a marketing maneuver. As one teacher said, part of the yoga for women, it's a way of packaging the yoga to almost market it like a gimmick or something. You market it to women, so then women go because it's just for them. And one teacher made a claim regarding the universality of yoga, saying, yoga is universal, it's first thing, and Patanjali also doesn't make difference between male and female. Another explained that it is not to make it too much about just yoga for women, but more yoga for who you are, or what your circumstances are, whoever you are, male or female. And yet another said, yoga is yoga, and it's universal. It's not genderized. And I maintain that the reason for not recognizing women-oriented yoga as a separate sub-discipline in the Iyengar tradition is rooted in the tendency to overlook gender in general and to assume that it doesn't matter. I disagree, and my findings suggest that this women-oriented yoga has significant implications regarding its practitioners. In Iyengar yoga, the practice is individually tailored, but I argue that when the practice is tailored to the individual, and that individual happens to be a woman, and then generalizations are made about women as a category, then it is what I recognize as women-oriented practices. So before going into the ways these practices reinforce womanhood and gender norms, let me first narrate briefly the historical background for the making of these practices. The Iyengar yoga tradition was founded and named after BKS Iyengar, who sought to tailor the yoga practice to suit the needs of the individual he was teaching. Individually adjusting each posture works well in one-on-one classes, but when teaching groups, a different approach is needed. Thus, as his classes grew, he developed general guidelines and distinguished between classical yoga practices, such as postures that are unmodified, original, and done without the use of yoga props, and adjusted or altered or modified yoga practices. Classical yoga is understood as pure, static, and monolithic that derives directly from Patanjali's teachings and from Sanskrit texts. And classical yoga postures are demonstrated in BKS Iyengar's famous book, Light on Yoga. Later during the 1960s, Iyengar's eldest daughter, Geeta Iyengar, began teaching. As a woman and the daughter of her father, she was well situated to teach women and adjust their yoga practice accordingly. As the Iyengar studentship grew and teachers were asking Geeta Iyengar's advice regarding their own female students, she began developing general guidelines to suit women's needs, which she put into writing, either in the form of a book she published in 1973 titled Yoga a Gem for Women, or in personal letters to teachers that sought out her advice. Individual-based modifications require direct and personal teachings by the teacher, while when publishing a text, the modification and adjustment are generalized, as one Iyengar yoga teacher told me in an interview. I think that's why our books are more generalized. It's challenging to get the nuance and again to adapt to individuals when you're writing to a general population. In 1997, Geeta Iyengar assembled the first International Women's Intensive, in which 61 teachers from different countries gathered at the Iyengar Institute for the workshop. During a week, specialized sequences, adjustments, and adaptations of postures were taught and practiced. The knowledge was put then into writing in the form of a chart containing the 6 cycles of what they call a woman's 6 cycles of a woman's life, namely puberty, menstruation, pregnancy. I'll say something about that later, postpartum, perimenopause, and postmenopause, with modifications to 51 postures and breath control techniques. And in the same year, Geeta Iyengar orchestrated a demonstration at the Iyengar Institute entitled The Role of Yoga in Women's Life, where teachers demonstrated various yoga postures and their variation using yoga props in accordance with women's life cycles. And since then, many publications saw light and women-oriented Iyengar yoga practices were made more explicit. To name a few, in 2002, Linda Sparrow and Iyengar teacher Patricia Walden published the Women's Book of Yoga and Health. In 2006, Iyengar teacher Lois Steinberg published Geeta Iyengar's Guide to a Woman's Yoga Practice. A year later, in 2007, Iyengar yoga teacher Bobby Clennell published the Women's Yoga book, Asana and Pranayama for All Phases of the Menstrual Cycle. And not long ago, in 2019, Iyengar teacher Rita Keller published the first comprehensive Iyengar book concerning menopause. And I recognize these publications as great contributors to the spread of the knowledge and practice of women-oriented Iyengar yoga practices worldwide. But what does it mean to accommodate women's needs? As the Iyengar yoga publications suggest, women-oriented Iyengar yoga practices aim to accommodate the corporal practices to females' changing physiology during menstruation, pregnancy, and menopause. I will give a specific example of how this is done later. Also, women are understood to have mental sociocultural needs. These are the socially inflicted and situated needs, such as providing a safe space to practice yoga and encouraging a sense of belonging. These include postpartum depression, low self-esteem and fear, and also sociocultural needs, such as the need to have same-sex classes. And here is a partial list of women's perceived needs as I recognize them in women-oriented practices. And as I see it, each need also implies what the Iyengar tradition thinks women lack of. So specialized women-oriented practices versus general practices imply that the general practices are unsuited for women and they need something special. Accentuating women's bodies in public implies that women's bodies are understood as invisible in a public sphere. Safe space as same-sex spaces imply that women in mixed spaces are actually not safe or feel unsafe. Connecting women to their bodies implies that women are not connected to their bodies due to sociocultural realities and need help creating that connection. Encouragement to overcome shyness and low self-esteem implies that women are shyer compared to men and have lower self-esteem and so on. And then women need to overcome these feelings in order to be happier, healthier, and more powerful. Balancing irregularities and sustaining fertility implies that fertility is extremely important for women and that they have a lot of imbalances as well. Facilitating pregnancy and postpartum, and also promoting pronatalist priorities over a vigorous and serious practice. These are related to the pronatalist view that females aspire to become mothers. But unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss all these points today, but you're more than welcome to ask about them in the Q&A later. I will address the first 3 points in the following slides. So here's a visual example of how a classical yoga practice, here's a yoga posture, is modified and changed in order to accommodate women's corporal needs. So the posture of Uttanasana, for example, the figure on the left depicts the classical posture where the head is touching the shins and the hands are placed behind the heels on the mat. This is similar to the depiction of BKS Iyengar in Light on Yoga. Next to it, the second picture from the left is the recommended variation for women during menstruation, as it does not press on the abdomen as much as the classical posture does. The feet are apart in order to create more space in the abdomen, according to the Iyengar tradition. Next, this picture depicts the recommended variation for pregnancy, where belts are tied around the thighs and shins, and the chest, head, and elbows are resting on a high support to create enough space in the abdomen for the growing fetus. The figure on the right depicts the recommended variation for menopause, where the head and elbows are supported with a prop, and the feet are kept apart while the toes are turned in. In this way, the posture is said to cool down with the woman's body and soothe menopausal symptoms. So in this way, not only that women's practice is visibly different from the general or classic practice, but it makes women more visible in a yoga class. As Geeta Iyengar wrote in Yoga: A Path to Holistic Health, at each stage of a woman's life, her body undergoes physical and psychological changes. The practice of yoga can be modified and adapted to suit her changing needs. So my second example refers to how female bodies are accentuated verbally. Female body-oriented verbal instructions are part of what I recognize as women-oriented practices. Feminist scholars agree that talking about female body parts, and especially about female genitalia in public, is an act of empowerment and inclusiveness towards women. This point was vocalized in interviews with Iyengar teachers as well, who told me how using specific instructions can invoke self-awareness, innate inner movement, and promote women's health. So for example, in the Iyengar International Women's Intensive that took place in '97, Geeta Iyengar said, focus on how to center the vagina, uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries through the action of the legs and feet. And in an interview, an Iyengar teacher told me, I actually talk about the uterus and the ovaries. I would say, move your ovary this way, move your right ovary that way, move your left ovary that way. Is the uterus lifted? And in an article from the Iyengar Yoga Quarterly Journal, Yoga Rahasya, Geeta Iyengar writes regarding the effects of Upavishta Konasana and variations, that it widens and relaxes the pelvis, widens the vagina, and reduces any obstructions to the menstrual flow. So my third example is of safe spaces. As a women-only environment, women's classes are viewed as providing a safe space for women. The concept of safe space emerged in the women's movement in the late 20th century and is used here to describe a space in which women feel free to be themselves, to lower their guard and be less self-conscious. An Iyengar yoga teacher called Jennifer told me that women's classes offer a good opportunity for a more internal experience, which enhances whatever is going on. And feminist academics recognize that separate spaces can present opportunities for reclaiming a shared identity and building friendships. A safe space is a space that offers solidarity and resistance for women, and in which they are able to affirm one another and heal the wounds inflicted by society. So one Iyengar yoga teacher told me in an interview that it's not as outspoken yet. In women's classes, it's easier to respect these sensitive issues, the traumatic issues, without naming them. Yeah, you can facilitate it more and not to push the areas which are too traumatic, but slowly to open them. Although the Iyengar tradition might intend to heal and empower women through these practices, I argue that they reinforce gender normative roles such as prenatal ideology, biology as destiny, and gender binary. When biological females are understood to be women, the conflation between gender and sex indicates an understanding of biology's destiny argument, which claims that women's behaviors and personalities are compelled by their biological sex. These practices also reinforce gender binary. As one Iyengar yoga teacher explained, since women are more prone to move in a certain way, it's a good thing to teach women a bit differently so they can look after themselves better in order to improve the quality of life. And Geeta Iyengar's statement that women-oriented instructions, that's how I would call them, are meant to help women to come back to their own nature and practice as women according to their femaleness. These undercurrent implications could be the reason for some of the resistance and negative feelings I've encountered in interviews with Iyengar teachers when discussing these practices. An Iyengar teacher told me in an interview why differentiating women might disempower them. I don't teach women's classes nor anything that differentiates. I think it creates a sort of fixation among practitioners of what I can't do. So to conclude, through examining the generalizations that are made in the process of developing women-oriented Iyengar yoga practices, we can clearly see how these practices do gender by reinforcing ideas regarding womanhood and gender binary. Through seeing what is offered to women in the declared intention of empowering them, we can deduce what is perceived to be lacking. It would be interesting to explore outside of the Iyengar tradition and perhaps in completely different spiritual practices and lived religions, how their efforts to accommodate women act as a gendering tool. Thank you. Here's one list of primary sources if you want to take a screenshot. And my bibliography, just some, and my contacts. Thank you.
Thank you, Aggie. That was fantastic. You covered a lot of ground really quickly there and introduced some really nice main themes for us. I'm just going to hand straight over to Ella to take us further into the divine feminine.
Thank you, Theo, for the introduction and putting this whole series together. And I'm so happy to be able to be part of it. And thanks also, Aggie. It was very nice to hear your presentation, and it functions quite as a nice starting point for me to continue. So let me just share my screen. So what I will do on my part is to address women-oriented spirituality a bit more generally by looking at this theme of the rise of the feminine, as my topic here says. So while Aggie had like this specific focus on the Iyengar tradition, my research and also this talk is more concerned with this kind of general trend within contemporary spirituality to target spiritual practice to women and to stress a feminine approach to the sacred or the divine. So there's this common idea coming up in the field of spirituality that women or the feminine is on the rise, and that this is going to affect not only the way in which spirituality is practiced, but also the society more at large. And sort of this tendency to feminize spirituality occurs within the field of yoga, but I also see it as a wider trend that sort of also serves to create dialogue and blur boundaries between different practices of contemporary spirituality. So I'm more interested sort of in following this idea of the rise of the feminine across the field of holistic spirituality in the West. So here's just a couple of examples of how this idea of the rise of the feminine comes up in women's spiritual books and podcasts, articles, and the like. So instead of just focusing on addressing women's needs, the idea of the rising feminine also stresses femininity as a quality that is lacking in our spiritual practice and the world at large. So the idea is that our masculine world is somehow lacking of feminine qualities, such as nurturing or compassion, creativity, softness, emotionality, and so on. So in other words, there is a critique of the patriarchal nature of both spiritual and religious traditions, as well as the society more generally. And what I think is intriguing about this idea of the rising feminine is, and this is sort of the central paradox I'm also addressing in this talk, that it, on the one hand, essentializes the missing feminine as natural to women and does this through targeting and adapting spirituality to women. And on the other hand, there's a common idea that the rise of the feminine is not about gender, but about creating balance between the feminine and the masculine as this kind of spiritual energies or qualities. So, let's see, no, I'm not, yeah. So when I'm talking about feminine spirituality, to me, it's partly an emic concept, so one coming up from the field, where many women are describing their approach to spirituality as feminine, in contrast to what they understand to be a masculine tradition. And on the other part, it also functions as a more ethic term, describing how gendering spirituality in this way also functions or sort of reflects and reinforces this kind of normalizing assumptions about what is typical for women in a given social and historical context. So in this talk, I'm going to draw from my experiences from the field of feminine spirituality. So I'm doing field work currently for my PhD project. And I'm studying different forms of spirituality. So, for example, practice of yoga, tantra, shamanism, and goddess spiritualities. And these are often combined with another or with each other, and then different kind of practices of holistic spirituality, women's circles, self-care, and things like this. So I've been doing participant observation, and this picture, for example, is from one of my women's retreats I was attending. And then I've done ethnographic interviews and also followed the sort of phenomenon more widely through reading women's spiritual books and blogs and podcasts and so on. So what then makes spirituality feminine? Now, this is a rough list of some of the characteristics through which feminine spirituality, or sort of this feminine approach to spirituality, is defined in the field, and how it's also contrasted to what is claimed to be a masculine and predominant way of practicing spirituality. So feminine spirituality would be often described as more body-oriented, involving embodied practice, listening to the body and the senses, while a masculine approach would be often described as more oriented towards a spirit or a consciousness and a detachment from or a controlling of the body. So, for example, in the context of yoga and asana practice with strict rules about alignment and the focus on meditation as only this kind of removing fluctuations from the mind is often understood to be masculine, because it's about control of the body and withdrawal from the senses, only focusing on some kind of pure consciousness, while a feminine approach or feminine yoga practice would be more about listening to the body, about intuitive movement and embracing the sensual and the emotional. And also a feminine approach would be often described to be more focusing on experience and following one's intuition, often open to or even promoting an eclectic mix of spiritual practices and following an inner teacher, whereas a masculine approach would be more concerned with knowledge and scripture, codifying, creating rules, and strictly following one tradition that is also often understood to be hierarchically built with some kind of outer authority. So this kind of boundary making between tradition is also seen as the masculine approach to define, rationalize, and control, which is also why it makes more sense to me to look at the feminine spirituality as a wider phenomenon binding different strands of contemporary spirituality together. I think there tends to be quite a strong emphasis towards practices and elements from modern yoga and tantra. And I think this is partly because they are body-oriented practices. And also the chakra system provides a convenient terminology for conceptualizing spiritual energy as embodied. And then finally, feminine spirituality is often presented as this worldly and life-affirming, and in this way also holistic, while a masculine approach is said to value transcendence and renouncing from worldly pleasures, and in this way only limited to one side of what spirituality is about. And typically feminine spirituality stresses the feminine not only as an energetic quality, but it also lifts up goddesses and feminine archetypes as kind of role models and representations of the divine feminine, which we somehow need in order to create balance between the feminine and the masculine. And when, again, like the Shiva and Shakti and Yin and Yang dyads are quite often loosely referred to conceptualize this feminine masculine balance. And also like goddesses from the Hindu and Buddhist traditions come up quite often, but so do like also Greek goddesses and the image of Mary Magdalene, for example. So there really isn't this kind of strong rejection of Christianity either that one maybe would expect to find. And at the same time as it's emphasized that the rise of the feminine is about bringing these two energies or ways of being and doing into balance in individuals as well as in the world more at large, there tends to be this underlying idea that this is going to happen through women. So, for example, in her self-help book, Calling Women to Find Their Voice and Their Divine Assignment Through Feminine Spirituality, women's leadership coach Tabby Biddle writes that when a woman's voice is absent, war, poverty, oppression, and violence are the name of the game. Aggression, competition, and power over, rather than power with, are the norm. But we as women know that this is not a natural way of living. And then she goes on to tell that the world is aching for feminine wisdom, compassion, connection, and community, and even begging women to step forward and contribute to the healing of this planet. So here women are sort of presented as the embodiment of these feminine qualities that are lacking in the world. Also, at the same time as feminine spirituality is said to be or at the same time as the feminine is said to be an energy and spiritual energy and not so much about gender, the focus on the body in feminine spirituality often means a focus on the female body specifically, which comes through also, as Agi was describing, this tendency to concentrate on the menstrual cycle. So listening to the body often means listening to the womb and taking into account the menstrual cycle and different phases in a woman's life. So one of my informants tells that menstruation is an initiation process to womanhood, and one should treat it to teach a girl to live according to the moon cycles and what it means in a woman's cycle. But no, it has been drawn all linear and then we become sick. So to return that kind of woman's bodily, because it's also consciousness, when you live in the rhythm of nature and understand those different phases, your consciousness will open, like the activation of the womb. We need to cleanse and open and activate the wisdom of the womb, which is immense. It's like direct knowledge. So even if it's many times emphasized that one should be sort of true to one's own inner voice and experience and follow this inner teacher, there still tends to be this kind of underlying ideas and guidelines concerning what it means for a woman to listen to her body. And what it means is to listen to your menstrual cycle and the wisdom of the womb, suggesting that if you don't, you're not being true to yourself as a woman. So even if the energies are claimed not to be about gender, the practices of feminine spirituality still become gendered through this kind of focus on the female body specifically, as well as a tendency to naturalize the feminine approach as somehow easier for women who are seen as closer to nature and this kind of direct or natural spiritual connection. And also the fact that it's women who are called to rise tends to further emphasize this by, in a sense, making women responsible for bringing about the balance. Now, from a feminist perspective, the description of femininity posed by feminine spirituality easily strikes as an uncomfortable reinforcement of this kind of hierarchical position of men as active subjects associated with reason, the mind, civilization, culture, and the public sphere, and then women as subjects associated with emotion, the primitive nature, and the private sphere of the family. And feminist theory has obviously been concerned with exposing how this hierarchical opposition has also functioned as a basis for women's oppression and questioning commonsensical facts about gender and the naturalization of gender roles by exposing them as constructed. And now this is obviously, or has been a very important critique and important insights, but it also tends to mean that there's tendency in feminist and queer theory to emphasize the subversion and transgression of gender norms. And there is sort of this reluctance towards New Age spirituality, which is seen to enforce normative gender roles and uphold this kind of binary and essentialist understandings of gender. So, for example, Ulrike Dahl has criticized what she calls the contempt for femininity in feminist theory and suggests that we be, and I quote, less interested in the dichotomies of gender than in infinite intracategorial variations of femininity. So I'm sort of interested into exploring what lies behind this maybe too hasty or obvious dismissal of feminine spirituality as only problematic and essentializing. So to finish, I want to give just some examples of how this idea of the feminine and the masculine as energies also serves in a way to stretch stereotypical women's roles and ideas about femininity, and how it enables fluid experiences and expressions of gender. So here's a quote from Katie Silcox, who's an American yoga teacher and Ayurvedic practitioner. And she writes in her Ayurvedic manual for women that the seat of female sexual power lies in the womb, the dark, fleshy home of our creative energies. What I learned is that in this sacred female womb, we create. Our creation makes babies, births social activism projects, produces art, bakes bread, and starts businesses. So here I think it's quite interesting that the centralizing of the womb does not necessarily mean foregrounding of motherhood and childcare as the core role that women have to play. So the womb could work as a space from which to birth babies and bake bread, but one could also choose to birth social activism, art, or a business. So one could perhaps say that this kind of traditional gender role is embraced and then stretched to promote women's agency in other areas of life and society. So quite interestingly, I think that womb wellness does not need to reinforce always this kind of pronatalist ideology either, can be used for other purposes. And working with the inner feminine and masculine energies gives rise to fluid understandings of gender also in some sense, and at least theoretically leaves room for non-binary gender identities and enables experiences of gender fluidity. So for example, one of my informants ponders the relationship between the feminine and the masculine energies and gender, and she says, well, I think quite simply that, okay, we are born into our body and we have one of these energies stronger, and then our body becomes manifests as male or as female or male. And I don't think too complicated about it. I myself know some people who do not want to determine their gender. Look, when I think about it energetically, I think it's very understandable. They don't want to identify with one energy or the other. And I also think it can change. Like, for example, me. If I look at myself when I was young, I was very feminine, but it can change. Like I myself on my path have moved more and more towards that balance. Like I have taken over that masculine energy in a whole another way. So here we are kind of first told that the energy that is stronger when you're born determines which gender you will manifest. Again, sort of essentializing women as naturally feminine or more strongly feminine than men. But then we're also told that it's understandable if you don't want to identify with any one energy, and the informant herself sees that the energies have changed in her own life. So in a way suggesting a non-binary understanding of gender and a fluidity in her own gender expression. And also another woman told me about her experience when she was leading a spiritual drumming session, so this kind of shamanic drumming session. And she said, I remember there was a group with women and it was one of my shape-shifting experiences. So suddenly something happened in the group and I was drumming. So I turned into a man. I felt I had a penis and I became this giant masculine and I played and I had to kind of pause. I remember it was many years ago. I got kind of frightened. So here this female identified spiritual coach in the setting of a women's group has this experience of shifting gender or temporarily becoming a man, again suggesting that gender experience is something malleable and contextual instead of fixed and binary. So to conclude, I think one could say that feminine spiritualities tend to be trapped in this kind of paradoxical wish to celebrate womanhood and femininity as a tool for women's empowerment, and at the same time go beyond the association of femininity and gender. So this means that if you sort of go looking for a reinforcement of problematic assumptions and representations of gender, you will most definitely find it. But then you might also miss the multiple ways in which gender norms are inhabited and negotiated. So thank you. And here is also a list of my references if somebody's interested.
Thank you, Ella. That was great. And I'm so glad, as I'm sure you are, the two of you are, that we put you both together. I think it really is an interesting couple of research projects to put together. We do have a few questions kind of coming in on the Slido. Do add yours according to the code 88128 on Slido. But before we do that, I'm going to exercise kind of host privilege and just say a couple of things that I think are really interesting, and if you want to respond to them. I'm really struck in both talks about this balance or this kind of interplay between the needs of women or the needs of female bodies and the need in the world for feminine influence that's seen in these different forms of spirituality, and how that really plays over and again with the difference between female bodies and femininity, and how those are never quite reconciled, right? That, you know, is being feminine, or does having a menstrual cycle or whatever else it might be, is that what makes you women? And it's like this interesting kind of interplay between those two things. And I wondered if both of you wanted to speak to that. Really, I'm going to start with Ella as you spoke last, if that's all right.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting also that somehow there isn't still like a need to also celebrate women's bodies and sort of breaking taboos around menstruation and this kind of stuff. And then sort of also there tends to be this, at least at some level, this kind of awareness of the fact that like these kind of gender categories are being like torn down, and there is a need for like gender sensitivity and sort of openness to different kind of experiences and identities.
I guess within, I mean, I guess that's the difference for me between a lot of divine feminine spirituality and queer theory, is that when I do see queer theory discussing femininity, it's very much not tied to bodies, it's tied to particular kind of social and cultural expressions rather than people's actual bodies, whereas divine feminine seems to come back over and again to things like the kind of either presence or previous presence of a womb, and that kind of the centrality of kind of that bodied experience. I guess I wonder if you see the same thing.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's sort of this kind of maybe the strategy in like feminist and queer theory has been like trying to like torn down this like gendered categories and sort of these binary oppositions, and sort of because it's a hierarchical vision, obviously, when women are like seen as like hysterical and emotional and connected to nature. And then in a way, I think that the strategy in feminine spirituality is more like embracing the sort of missing feminine and reclaiming it. So then there is also this need to sort of place it in bodies.
Yeah. And so, Aggie, I'm wondering if what connection within Iyengar Yoga you see to spiritualizing that femaleness. Does that happen within Iyengar Yoga in your experience? Because I'm not sure whether it's particularly a British thing, but in my experience, British Iyengar Yoga at least seems to be relatively secular in a very kind of specific way in many cases.
Let me answer first your first question, and then I'll come to this one. I'd like to use Ella's terminology and just point out that the Iyengar tradition sees classical yoga as masculine and as male body centered. And that is why when they decided that they are teaching women, they said, okay, we have to adjust, we have to modify, we have to include them, and they need something else. We can't use the classical practices or even the classical Sanskrit terminology that we use for men. And then they see women as having needs, right? As I just said. So there is a need for this accommodation. Now, when it comes to spirituality, yes, there is a big or a huge spiritual aspect to Iyengar Yoga, and it is said to be more advanced. So maybe since advanced classes are less frequent, you see it less. But yes, there is a big part of spirituality to it, which I would say is more masculine, if I would use Ella's terminology. But when my informants or the teachers I interviewed talked about the benefits of these women-oriented practices, they talked about how they are connected to their body through the cycles, how A woman during pregnancy that practices yoga is more spiritually connected to the power of creation and her fetus and so on. So there is a huge aspect of accessing the spiritual through the corporal when it is adjusted, accommodating, and so on. So women need this bridge. They can't just go through the front door. They need their own path that leads them there. But yes, of course.
Thank
I
you.
hope that answers your question.
No, it does. It's fantastic, and it will lead us really nicely into the Slido. And just as much for you as anything else is that there are historical reasons. I think Suzanne, you can really go into this really well as to why many Iyengar Yoga classes became very secularized in the UK because they were being offered through specific educational environments in which that kind of removal of any religious content was kind of the price for entry of getting into a lot of local education authorities, which is why I'm kind of fascinated as to how that differs elsewhere.
If I can say something about
yes,
that.
go.
Iyengar Yoga classes tend to open with what they call a prayer or an invocation to Patanjali, this semi-god or the source of modern yoga, if you'd like. And in Israel, where there are religious communities, Orthodox Jewish communities, but this is also true for Muslim communities in Muslim countries, they skip the prayer in the beginning, and they don't have idols in classes, and they don't have, because Iyengar Yoga is actually saturated with Hindu representations and traces of Hinduism all through.
Thank you. That's a really helpful summary, I think. I'm going to pass straight to the Slido. Our first question is an anonymous one, so and it is for you, so I'll read it out. And where this person is asking for you to elaborate, how did your informants argue that taking womanhood into consideration in Iyengar Yoga practice was regarded as a restriction rather than an empowerment?
Oh, that's easy. I located two cultural settings or ideologies of what does it mean to be a woman. So I interviewed only teachers, and some teachers said, yes, doing something different is extremely empowering. Being among sisters gives a sense of togetherness and so on. And others said, I'm no different than a man. And during my menstruation, I don't feel the need to practice differently. Let me do my inversions, my headstand, my shoulder stand as I want to. Don't enforce these restrictions on me. I'm equal to men and so on. So this came on very strongly. And it comes to the point that women hide their so-called menstrual identity from their teachers. They don't tell their teachers. With pregnancy, it's harder to hide, but they just don't tell the teachers. So the teacher wouldn't tell them to practice differently.
Nice, thank you. And the next two questions kind of cover similar ground, and they're for Ella. It's coming in quite nicely and alternating here. So Ella, the first one is Gukuran. I don't know if Gukuran is here.
Hi, I'm here.
Hey, thank you. Do you want to actually ask your question personally?
Yeah, sure. I'll just read it how I typed it. Could you please talk about the first two elements listed in the chart regarding the feminine and the masculine spirituality? And from, if my memory serves right, it was about the feminine side suggesting that it was more body orientated versus the masculine side suggested it was more spirit or consciousness orientated. And I think the second one was the embodied practice versus what would consider the masculine of the meditation / detachment. And I just wanted you to kind of elaborate on that and how that's come to be that way and not the other way around.
And thank you for remembering that for us.
Well, it was a great presentation by both of you, so it was easy to remember. Thank you.
Ella.
Yeah, well, the idea tends to be that sort of when you are or there is also this kind of idea that spirituality is not only like about you know, from the head up. It's about like using the mind, like sort of the rationale for going like somewhere up, but it's about also bringing the spiritual down to the body. And obviously, because women are sort of seen as more embodied beings, and men are like the rational beings. So that's why I think it's sort of this like spirit or consciousness is thought to be like the masculine, and then the body is like the feminine. And also like the idea about masculine spirituality being about meditation and detachment. So also like this kind of idea that like you are trying to withdraw from the senses, you're trying to forget the body and only like go from the head up. So they want to bring the spirit, whatever it is, down to the body and to this earth, where like women are seen more connected to the earth and the body. And so hope that answers your question.
So it's as much a kind of direction of travel as anything else. It's that difference between the kind of liberating and the manifesting, right? Is it the feminine is the manifesting and the masculine is the liberating kind of energies. And I'm just aware of that, having been, I've heard that in classes somewhere, specifically addressed that way. Yeah. Okay. So going back, actually the second question in that is I don't know how much you can answer this, but is looking at if you can elaborate on that feminine masculine spirituality model in relation to the rise of New Age, New Age spirituality specifically, how it relates to New Age spirituality more generally.
Oh, can you repeat it?
So your model of the kind of the divine feminine, which is based obviously on your research, I guess what's being asked here is how that relates to New Age spirituality more generally, because this feels like a description of masculine and feminine that's very specific to practitioners of these feminine forms.
Well, I think that, well, it's interesting in the sense that like New Age spirituality is obviously very gendered. So, I mean, most of the people engaged in this kind of spiritualities are women. So in this setting, I think it's also interesting that women tend to have the need to further like feminize these, these practices. But also like I was referring to like the way in which also the image like of Mary Magdalene comes up. So in a way, I think you would maybe expect to find this kind of opposition between sort of these institutionalized religions of like which are considered to be like the most like sexist and patriarchal. And then sort of New Age spirituality as more sort of liberating for women and more feminine in themselves. But what I found that also this kind of distinction between New Age and like, for example, Christianity tends to sort of get blurred. So people who are engaged, for example, in the yoga scenes are talking about Mary Magdalene and the edition of Mary Magdalene. So
yeah, even drawing those boundaries around the New Age as a whole is a very difficult thing to do. Yeah, I understand that. So going back neatly to Aggie then, Sally Kennedy, we can find Sally, has a nice question. Sally.
Forgive me, I'm feeling very intimidated in this group of people and I'm struggling to keep up with some of the conversation. But my point was kind of around, particularly in Buddhist iconography, a lot of the images of are of ungendered people. You know, you can't really tell whether they're masculine or feminine. They have some sort of suggestion of breasts and very sort of, you know, androgynous faces, and that's deliberate in many cases, and I wondered how much of that translates into the Iyengar tradition particularly, but other yoga traditions.
I think that's a really good question. As you started with Iyengar, let's ask Aggie first.
So I'm not sure I can follow because they don't use Buddhist iconography and they have a really strong gender binary notion. So maybe if you could ask it
I think what Sally's asking is, a lot of the traditional representations of particularly of the Buddha or other Buddhist figures are very gender neutral. It's very they're kind of very ungendered images, and I wonder, I think what Sally's asking is there a place for that kind of ungendered imagery within Iyengar yoga as well? You seem to be saying no, not so much.
I mean, they're into gender norms and gender normativity, and there is a social construct, and they are very much submerged into that. However, I would say that Prashanta Iyengar, and I did not go into that in my research, says that when you practice yoga, you're neither a man or a woman, you're neither Sally or Aggie, and that through practice you can transcend your identity and your gender identity. I did not hear that echoed in interviews at all, and I don't see that in Iyengar yoga classes at all. But maybe that's the closest I could get to what you were implying.
Yeah, thank you.
And there's always more data to be found, right? I'm sure there's probably somebody on the call who knows of an example that contradicts it, because that's the point of researching contemporary practice. There's always more data. Ella, I'm wondering again, if we ask about the New Age more generally, if you're aware of that kind of more specifically and deliberately non-gendered representation.
Well, I'm not so familiar with Buddhist iconography either, but I think that like there tends to be this kind of celebration of like like feminine goddess figures. So like kind of these androgynous goddesses are not the ones that are like so interesting to people within feminine spirituality, I would say, even if there is this idea of the balance, like yin and yang and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are styles of yoga that do explore that kind of thing, but I don't think they're necessarily the ones that we're talking about here. Necessarily, and I know what it's like to be asked stuff that's outside of your research. There is a point where you have to say, I don't know, because I study this thing, not that thing. I'm going to come to the next question then, and I'm struggling to understand this question a little bit, but it's from an anonymous source. It's asking whether we're talking about women of European descent, and I think it's an opportunity to ask about the kind of wider demographics of the movements we're talking about here. This the divine feminine kind of feminine spirituality movement. Is that also very much an American and European movement? Is it very much a white movement? Is it a young versus old movement? I wonder if you can give us a sense of that, Ella.
I've only studied it in the European or Anglo-American context, so I cannot really say, and it tends to be a bubble, so I'm not like hearing people referring to somebody like outside of that context, and tends to be quite white-centered, but there is like an increasing awareness about, questions of cultural appropriation, for example. So I find that there tends to be this kind of increasing tendency also to sort of bring in people of color, for example, into, let's say, like a podcast, a spiritual podcast, to be interviewed and discuss around this.
Thank you. I'm aware also, I don't know if you're aware, but Kavita Maya did a PhD research specifically into that the issues of race within feminine spirituality here in the UK. So yeah, remind me and I'll drop you that reference, which is really interesting. Of course, for Aggie, if we're talking about Iyengar Yoga and women-oriented Iyengar Yoga, from what you're saying, that specifically Indian and South Asian perspective is there right from the start, right? Because it's Geeta's work.
Yes. But I would say that there's a dialogue between East and West there, because Geeta was adjusting the practice to whoever she was teaching one-on-one. And in the beginning, that was other Indian women and Indian girls. But then she began teaching her father's students, who were Europeans, Americans, Australians, and so on. And they had, I would say, different cultural needs. They weren't as shy. They were more outspoken about feminist issues. They were not concerned with how to dress to yoga class and so on. So when she did these general guidelines, they were mainly for the outsiders outside of the Iyengar Institute in India. So in a way, it's an Indian understanding of what Western women need. But then again, they were teaching Japanese women from the start. They were teaching Turkish women. I mean, the Iyengar Institute is kind of a hive where everyone so many people came and learned from, and at the same time they made the Iyengars understand different aspects of womanhood. So it is rooted in Hindu ideology and understanding, but then it was affected by all these people coming in.
For some very, very diverse societies, by the sounds of it, in many ways. Thank you. That's really interesting. I have one last one I'm going to pull up, which is from Gemma. If somebody can ask Gemma to unmute. You got Gemma. If not, I can ask it. No, audio is obviously not working. So what Gemma's saying is that tailor-made yoga has not been made just towards women and not just in Iyengar, that there's kind of a wider project here of accessibility, and how I guess reading between the lines, what Gemma's asking is how that gendered aspect of what's happening relates to that accessibility, different kinds of accessibility elsewhere in terms of empowerment and disempowerment.
That's a great question, because the project, yes, it is, because the project of the Iyengar tradition is to be accessible for all. And they went through this process of democratizing yoga and making it accessible for disabled people, for children, for old age. And they kind of mark it on their flag, like it's good for everyone, because you can use props, because the essence is not to achieve an advanced posture, but it's the journey and so on. But then again, if you would ask me what about the transgender community, or what about queer theory, then I would be hesitant to say that they are that inclusive. I think the closest they get to that is when in the 80s, when HIV was thriving, BKS Iyengar made up a sequence to heal HIV, and that was spread around the world. And teachers who were having HIV were practicing it, and till today they swear that that's what saved their lives. So that was a time also where teachers inside of India, but I think outside of it, were a bit hesitant to deal with people with HIV. And BKS Iyengar just took it hands-on and kind of said, we can help everyone, which is, yeah, that's what they said anyway.
Yeah, and I guess I also want to reflect that we see a great rise in kind of specific classes in many other ways in the last kind of across yoga as a whole, and we're seeing kind of queer specific and queer solidarity classes. We're seeing trans specific classes. We're seeing, but we're also seeing specific classes for specific disabilities, in different ways, and it's always interesting to see that balance between the therapeutic intervention, i.e. this population has specific needs and we can help them, and the ways in which these are kind of spaces of solidarity, spaces of specificity, empowerment, in which those communities come together to do something together. And I guess that balance is always is kind of, this is the gender in yoga is kind of a case study for that balance more widely, I guess. I'm going to slightly put you both on the spot and ask if you have any questions for each other at this point.
Yes, I have a question for Ella. You said that in spiritual, the feminine spiritual, there is this problem of being trapped between the celebration of womanhood and empowerment and so on, but also in reinforcing gender norms. And that kind of echoed what I said. So do you see it as a trap, or as just now Theo said, a kind of a balance? Or is it a good trap? Is it an academic trap? What do you think?
Well, I think it's more like a theoretical trap. So I don't see, or I don't think that they would find themselves in that trap. I'm finding them in that trap, sort of at the same time, like wanting to celebrate femininity and like women's empowerment through like the kind of embracing of like all these qualities that women have been linked to, and then at the same time like wishing to sort of go beyond gender and sort of saying that that it's not about gender really, it's about the energy. So to them there is no trap, but to me there seems to be
that's a question. Yes. It's probably getting late for you. I don't know if you have any questions for Aggie. Well,
I don't think it's a question, but to me it would be interested also to, or I don't know, probably you have maybe you have discussed it with students, but you said that you only interviewed teachers around these things, but I would also be interested to hear more like how students feel about these like women oriented practices.
So as you said, I just interviewed teachers, but I do have second-hand experiences. So teachers told me that their students told them how they experienced, which is a real trap for me as a researcher, because I guess that teachers told me about the positive parts and they kind of left out the more interesting bits. But then teachers who were more into dialogue and discussing things with students instead of enforcing this women-oriented practice on them, they did tell me about, oh, I have students who have problems with this practice and they tell me this and that, and then I offer a solution. So those are the instances when I heard them talking about their students, or of course, all the success stories of, I had a student who couldn't get pregnant and then she came to my classes and after a year she got pregnant and so on. So I got a lot of success stories. But that's, I mean, censored in a way, or so, let's say selected evidence.
I also want to say I realize as we're speaking that that kind of small case study, in-depth ethnographic work in yoga studies, contemporary yoga studies, is often done with teachers. My work was done with teachers in the same way, and that the sociological broader picture stuff is done with practitioners. It's done with that kind of wider population, and I think it reflects kind of what kind of both approaches bring to our understanding of what's going on, from the kind of large and general and broad stuff down to the kind of, okay, what's going on at the heart of this kind of case study things. So it's really nice to reflect that tonight. So let me say this. So Aggie, forgive me for not knowing, are you doing a book? Is now the PhD is done? I know you're rather busy, but will there be a monograph?
Yes, there will be a monograph.
Good. All right.
And I will probably be excommunicated because of it, but that's the price to pay.
Yeah, well, welcome to the club many people are in. Good, you can come back and do an event for us when that comes out. And Ella, I know this is a horrible question to ask, but when's the end point? When do you submit?
Well, as I said, I'm now like in the fieldwork phase, so I have a long process to go, but
nice.
But yeah, I would like to say 2.5 years.
We won't hold you to that, but we can bring you back when closer to the end. That'd be really nice.
Yeah.
All right, I want to thank both of you for a really nice discussion tonight and really interesting questions from the audience as well. This is for the moment is the end of our kind of conversation format on Monday nights for the Women in Yoga series. We go back to our standard format on Wednesday with Olga Serbayeva.